Chapter 10. The 3D Hypno Ring. The next morning, George and Harold didn't arrive early at Mr. Krupp's house to wash his car and reshingle his roof. In fact, they were even a little late getting to school. When they finally showed up, Mr. Krupp was standing at the front door waiting for them. And boy, was he mad. Mr. Krupp escorted the boys into his office and slammed the door. "All right, where have you two been this morning?" he growled. "We wanted to come over to your house," said George, "but we were busy trying to figure out the secret of this ring." "What ring?" snapped Mr. Krupp. George held up his hand and showed the ring to Principal Krupp. "It's got one of those weird patterns on it," said Harold. "If you stare at it long enough, a picture appears." "Well, hold it still," snarled Mr. Krupp. "I can't see the darn thing." "I have to move it back and forth," said George, "or else it won't work." Mr. Krupp's eyes followed the ring back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. "You have to stare deeper into the ring," said Harold. "Deeper, deeper, deeper." "You're getting sleepy," said George. "Very sleepy." Mr. Krupp's eyelids began to droop. "I'm so sleepy," he mumbled. After a few minutes, Mr. Krupp's eyes were closed tight and he began to snore. "You are under our spell," said George. "When I snap my fingers, you will obey our every command." Snap. "I will obey," mumbled Mr. Krupp. "All right," said George. "Have you still got that videotape of me and Harold?" "Yes," mumbled Mr. Krupp. "Well, hand it over, bub," George instructed. Mr. Krupp did as he was told. He unlocked a large cabinet and opened the bottom drawer. He reached in and handed George the videotape. George stuffed it into his backpack. Harold took a different video out of his backpack and put it in the file cabinet. "What's that video?" asked George. "It's one of my little sister's old Boomer the Purple Dragon sing-along videos." "Nice touch," said George. Chapter 11. Fun with Hypnosis. When Harold bent down to close the file cabinet, he took a quick look inside. "Whoa!" he cried. "Look at all the stuff in here!" The file cabinet was filled with everything Mr. Krupp had taken away from the boys over the years. There were slingshots, whoopee cushions, skateboards, fake doggy doo-doo. You name it, it was in there. "Look at this!" cried George. "A big stack of Capt Underpants comics!" "He's got every issue," said Harold. For hours, the two boys sat on the floor laughing and reading their comics. Finally, George looked up at the clock. "Yikes," he said. "It's almost lunchtime. We better clean up this mess and get to class." The boys looked up at their principal, who had been standing behind them in a trance all morning. "Gee, I almost forgot about Mr. Krupp," said Harold. "What should we do with him?" "Do you want to have some fun?" asked George. "Why not?" said Harold. "I haven't had any fun in the last 4 to 6 weeks." "Cool," said George. He walked up to Mr. Krupp and snapped his fingers. "You're a chicken," he said. Suddenly, Mr. Krupp leapt onto his desk and flapped his arms. "Cluck, cluck, 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 cluck," he cried, kicking his papers off his desk behind him and pecking at his pen-pencil set. George and Harold howled with laughter. Let me try, said Harold. You're a monkey." "No, you gotta snap your fingers," said George. "Oh yeah," said Harold. You're a monkey." Suddenly, Mr. Krupp sprang off his desk and began swinging from the fluorescent light fixtures. "Ooh-ah, ooh-ah," he shrieked, leaping from one side of the room to the other. George and Harold laughed so hard they almost cried. My turn, said George. "Let's see, what should we turn him into next?" "I know," said Harold, holding up Capt Underpants' comic. "Let's turn him into Captain Underpants." "Good idea," said George. You are now the greatest superhero of all time, the amazing Captain Underpants. Mr. Krupp tore down the red curtain from his office window and tied it around his neck. Then he took off his shoes, his socks, his shirt, his pants, and his awful toupee. Tra-la-la, he sang. Mr. Krupp stood before them looking quite triumphant, with his cape blowing in the breeze of the open window. George and Harold were dumbfounded. You know, said George, he kind of looks like Captain Underpants. Yeah, said Harold. After a short silence, the two boys looked at each other and burst out laughing. George and Harold had never laughed so hard in their lives. Tears ran down their faces as they rolled on the floor shrieking in hysterics. After a while, George pulled himself up from the floor for another look. Hey, George cried. Where'd he go? Chapter 12. Out the window. George and Harold dashed to the window and looked out, and there, running across the parking lot, was a pudgy old guy in his underwear with a red cape flowing behind him. Tra-la-la! Mr. Krupp, come back! Shouted Harold. He won't answer to that, said George. He thinks he's Captain Underpants now. Oh, no, said Harold. He's probably running off to go fight crime, said George. Oh, no, said Harold. And we gotta stop him, said George. Oh, no, cried Harold. No way. Look, said George. He could get killed out there. Harold was unmoved. Or worse, said George, we could get in big trouble. You're right, said Harold. We gotta go after him. The two boys opened the bottom file cabinet drawer and took out their slingshots and skateboards. Do you think we should bring anything else? Asked Harold. Yeah, said George. Let's bring the fake doggy doo-doo. Good thinking, said Harold. You never know when fake doggy doo-doo is gonna come in handy. Harold stuffed Mr. Krupp's clothes, shoes, and toupee into his backpack. Then together the two boys leapt out the window, slid down the flagpole, and took off on their skateboards after the amazing Captain Underpants. Chapter 13. Bank Robbers. George and Harold rode their skateboards all over town looking for Captain Underpants. I can't find him anywhere, said Harold. You'd think a guy like him would be easy to spot, said George. Then the two boys turned a corner, and there he was. Captain Underpants was standing in front of a bank looking quite heroic. Mr. Krupp! Cried Harold. Shh, said George. Don't call him that. Call him Captain Underpants. Oh, yeah, said Harold. And don't forget to snap your fingers, said George. Right, said Harold. Ring! Ring! But before he got a chance, the bank doors flew wide open, and out stepped two robbers. The robbers took one look at Captain Underpants and stopped dead in their tracks. Surrender, said Captain Underpants, or I will have to resort to wedgie power. Oh, no, whispered Harold and George. Nobody moved for about 10 seconds. Finally, the robbers looked at each other and burst out laughing. They dropped their loot and fell on the sidewalk screaming in hysterics. Almost immediately, the cops showed up and arrested the crooks. Let that be a lesson to you, cried Captain Underpants. Never underestimate the power of underwear. The police chief looked quite angry. He marched over to Captain Underpants. And just who the heck do you think you're supposed to be? The police chief demanded. Why, I'm Captain Underpants, the world's greatest superhero, said Captain Underpants. I fight for truth, justice, and all that is pre-shunk and cottony. Oh, yeah, shouted the police chief. Cuff 'em, boys. One of the cops took out his handcuffs and grabbed Captain Underpants by the arm. Uh-oh, cried George. We gotta roll. Together, the two boys zoomed into the crowd, weaving in and out of the cops and bystanders. Harold skated up to Captain Underpants and knocked the superhero off his feet. George caught him, and the boys skated away with Captain Underpants on their shoulders. Stop! Cried the cops, but it was too late. George, Harold, and Captain Underpants were gone. Chapter 14. The Big Bang. After their quick escape, George, Harold, and Captain Underpants stopped on a deserted street corner to catch their breath. Okay, said George. Let's dehypnotize him quick before something else, kaboom, happens. A huge explosion came from the rare crystal shop across the street. Heavy smoke poured out of the building, and suddenly 2 robots with one stolen crystal emerged from the smoke and jumped into an old van. Did I just see 2 robots get into a van? Asked Harold. You know, said George, up until now, this story was almost believable. Well, believable or not, said Harold, we're not getting involved. I repeat, we are not getting involved. Just then, Captain Underpants leapt from the street corner and dashed in front of the van. Stop, in the name of underwear, he cried. Uh-oh, said George. I think we're involved. The 2 robots started up a van and swerved around Captain Underpants. Unfortunately, the van brushed up against his red cape and it got caught. With a mighty jerk, Captain Underpants flipped backward and the van pulled him along as it drove away. Grab him! cried George. The 2 boys skateboarded with all their might toward the speeding van and grabbed Captain Underpants by the ankles. Help! They cried as the van pulled them through the city streets. Mommy, said a little boy sitting on the bench, I just saw 2 robots driving a van with a guy in his underwear hanging off the back by a red cape, pulling 2 boys on skateboards behind him by his feet. How do you expect me to believe such a ridiculous story? Asked his mother. Screech! Finally, the van came to a screeching halt in front of an old abandoned warehouse. The sudden stop made Captain Underpants flip over the roof of the van and crash through the front door of the building. Well, said a strange voice from inside the warehouse. It looks as if we have a visitor. Chapter 15, Dr. Diaper. George and Harold hid behind the van until the coast was clear. Then they sneaked up to the hole in the door and peeked inside. Captain Underpants was all tied up with the 2 robots standing guard, and a strange little man wearing a diaper was laughing mechanically. I am the evil Dr. Diaper, the strange little man told Captain Underpants, and you will be the first to witness my takeover of the world. Dr. Diaper placed the stolen crystal into a large machine called the Lasermatic 2000. The machine started to light up and made loud noises. Heavy gears began shifting and spinning, and a laser beam from the crystal shot straight up through the hole in the roof. In exactly 20 minutes, this laser beam will blow up the moon and send huge chunks of it crashing down upon every major city in the world. Ha ha ha! Laughed Dr. Diaper. Then I will rise from the rubble and take over the planet. Only one thing can help us now, said George. What? Asked Harold. Rubber doggy doo-doo, said George. Harold took the fake doggy doo-doo and a slingshot from George's backpack and handed them to him. Be careful, said Harold. The fate of the entire planet is in your hands. With careful and precise aim, George shot the rubber doo-doo through the air and across the room. It landed with a plop right next to the feet of Dr. Diaper. Yes, whispered George and Harold. Dr. Diaper looked down at the doo-doo between his feet and turned bright red. Oh, dear me, he cried. I'm dreadfully embarrassed. Please excuse me. He began to waddle toward the restroom. This has never happened to me before, I assure you, he said. I guess with all the excitement, I just, oh dear. Dr. Diaper was off changing himself. George and Harold sneaked into the old warehouse. Immediately, the robots detected the boys and began marching toward them. Destroy the intruders, said the robots. Destroy the intruders. George and Harold screamed and ran to the back of the warehouse. Luckily, George found 2 old boards and gave one of them to Harold. "We're not going to have to resort to extremely graphic violence, are we?" asked Harold. "I sure hope not," said George.